Welcome to the Velvet Myth. I'm Adam, and I'm so happy you've chosen to spend this quiet moment with me. However your day unfolded, whatever thoughts or worries may still be lingering, I hope this story offers a peaceful place to set them aside for a while. A small refuge at the end of the day where you can simply rest. Each story is created with care, and it always means so much to hear from those who listen. If you wake feeling a little more rested tomorrow, I'd love for you to leave a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. Our little community stretches across the world, and it's always a joy to see the places from which these stories are shared. But tomorrow can wait. For now, allow yourself to become comfortable. Notice the gentle support beneath you, the softness of your blanket, the quiet stillness of the room around you. There's nothing you need to change, and nowhere else you need to be. Simply let yourself settle into this moment. Allow your shoulders to soften. Let your jaw relax. Feel the muscles around your eyes growing pleasantly heavy as the day slowly loosens its grip. With every unhurried breath, imagine the busyness of the day drifting farther away, like distant lanterns disappearing into the evening mist. Your thoughts don't need to chase anything now. No plans to make, no problems to solve. Only the comfort of the present moment, the gentle rhythm of your breathing, and a story waiting quietly to unfold. Take a slow breath in and let it go. Then another. And now settle a little deeper as we make our way to Clara's grandmother's cozy farmhouse in Vermont, where a gentle autumn story awaits. The road narrowed to a single lane somewhere past the covered bridge, and Clara Whitmore stopped trusting her GPS entirely. She followed the hill instead, the way her hands seemed to remember before her mind caught up, winding up through a corridor of maple trees that burned amber and deep crimson in the last of the evening light. Her headlights hadn't come on yet, but they almost needed to. Dusk was arriving, with that particular October efficiency, pulling colour from the sky the way someone draws a curtain. She almost missed the turnoff. She always almost missed the turnoff. The farmhouse appeared at the crest of the hill the way it always did, suddenly and as if it had been waiting. The porch light was already on, casting a small, warm circle into the blue-grey air, and the swing, at the far end of the porch, moved in a slow, unprompted arc, as though the house was keeping itself company. Clara pulled up beside the old oak, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet. It was loud, the quiet out here. Crickets, wind through the high branches, the distant suggestion of something, a creek maybe, or just the meadow breathing. She climbed out, pulled her wool coat tighter, and reached into the back seat for her bag. She'd packed light. One night, she'd told herself on Wednesday. 2 at the absolute most. She had a call Monday morning, a report due Tuesday, and a gym class she'd been rescheduling since August. Biscuit found her before she reached the porch steps. The old golden retriever made his way down with the careful dignity of a dog who no longer hurried for anything. his butterscotch coat pale in the porch light, one ear flopped endearingly sideways. He didn't bark. He simply arrived beside Clara's legs and leaned, a warm, solid, unhurried weight, as if to say, "Yes, good. You're here." "Hi, old man," Clara murmured, and let her bag drop long enough to put both hands in his fur. The front door opened. Nora Whitmore stood in the frame, wearing her faded floral apron over a cream, cable-knit sweater. Her silver hair half escaped from its tortoiseshell clip, her hazel eyes catching the porch light with an alertness that her easy posture deliberately contradicted. "You're letting the cold in just by standing in it," Nora said warmly. Come in, come in." Inside, Clara traded her city boots for a pair of old rubber ones by the door, then abandoned those for wool socks on the kitchen flagstones. Nora lifted Clara's coat from her shoulders without ceremony and remarked, not unkindly, that city people dressed for autumn as though autumn were a suggestion. The kettle had already begun to whistle. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon and something slower than the week Clara just survived. She pulled out a chair and sat down. The light outside was going fast. That particular October speed, where golden becomes amber, becomes gone almost before you notice. And Nora was already moving toward the back door, with the purposeful shuffle of someone who had been watching the sky all day and knew exactly how much time remained. "Garden first," Nora announced, lifting a wicker basket from its hook. "Then soup, then bread if your arms still work." Clara followed her out into the cooling air, past the herb bed and the straggling pole beans, to where the pumpkin vines had sprawled magnificently all summer and now lay spent and crackling underfoot. A handful of sugar pumpkins still sat among the leaves, like small, perfectly contented planets. Nora assessed them, with the gravity of a woman selecting something important, which, Clara was beginning to understand, was exactly how her grandmother approached most things. Biscuit materialized from somewhere near the carrot bed, moving with that unhurried authority of his, nose working the ground ahead of him, like a very elderly detective with excellent instincts. He emerged with a crooked carrot jutting from his mouth at a cheerful angle, looking directly at Clara, in the particular way of a dog who had done nothing wrong and had no plans to feel differently about it. "Biscuit," Nora said simply, without turning around. Biscuit set the carrot down with immense dignity. He did not move away from it. Clara laughed, an unguarded sound that surprised her slightly, the way the first real laugh after a long week always does. Nora chose a pumpkin, small and firm and richly orange, and handed it to Clara without ceremony. It was heavier than expected, warm from the last of the day's sun, and Clara carried it inside, cradled against her chest like something worth protecting. At the kitchen sink, Clara scrubbed the dirt from its smooth skin, while Nora set a heavy-bottomed pot on the stove and dropped in a generous curl of butter with the confidence of someone who had never once second-guessed butter. A few sage leaves followed, and the kitchen began to smell like something that belonged in October specifically. Not a candle's imitation of it, but the actual thing. Nora handed Clara an onion and a knife, without asking whether she knew how to use either, which felt like a small act of faith. "You never measure anything," Clara observed, watching Nora tip dried thyme from the jar in a loose, practiced pour. "I measure," Nora said serenely. "I just measure with my hands." The onions went into the butter, translucent and sweet, and the pumpkin followed in rough cubes, and the pot filled with broth and a patience that the kitchen seemed to have its own supply of. Clara found herself stirring when asked, and then continuing to stir after she was no longer asked, just because the rhythm of it was pleasant and required nothing else from her. "The soup improves," Nora said, appearing at her elbow to taste a small spoonful and nod with quiet satisfaction. "If it's stirred by someone who's been too busy for too long. Something about the energy." "That's not how cooking works," Clara said. "Isn't it?" Nora replied, which was not a question. They tore bread over the counter, ate standing up for the first taste, and declared it good. Below the table, Biscuit had taken up his station, settling onto Clara's feet with a warmth that felt entirely deliberate. She did not move them. The soup was even better sitting down. Clara couldn't explain why that was true. Perhaps it was the table itself, an old pine thing worn smooth at the edges from decades of elbows and homework and holiday meals. But something about being properly seated with a bowl in front of her made the first spoonful taste like an event. Nora settled opposite her and, without asking, leaned over and swirled a thin ribbon of cream across the surface of Clara's bowl with the confidence of someone administering medicine. "There," Nora said, satisfied. "What is that?" "That is what makes autumn tolerable." Nora sat back and picked up her spoon. "You're welcome." Clara tasted it. The cream softened everything. The earthiness of the pumpkin, the bite of the sage. And she was quiet for a moment, in the particular way a person goes quiet when they don't want to admit someone was right. Nora watched her with those bright hazel eyes and said nothing at all, which was somehow worse. They talked the way people do when there is no agenda pressing, at the edges of the conversation. Nora mentioned that the old ceramic rooster that used to sit on the windowsill had finally been retired to the barn after an incident she described only as diplomatic, and Clara laughed so suddenly she nearly lost a mouthful of soup. Clara remembered, out loud, that she used to refuse to eat the crusts of Nora's bread, until Nora told her they were the part that had been closest to the fire and therefore had the most flavour. She had believed this for an embarrassingly long time. "That was true," Nora said. "Grandma." "Loosely true." After supper, they stood at the sink together, Nora washing and Clara drying with a faded blue dish towel that had lived in this kitchen longer than Clara had been alive. The work was small and companionable. Below them on the braided rug, Biscuit exhaled, a long, sonorous, deeply committed sigh that seemed to express something on behalf of all of them. Clara and Nora looked at each other and laughed, quietly, the kind of laugh that doesn't need explaining. Outside, the birds had gone still. Crickets had taken over the meadow, filling the dark with a sound that felt less like noise and more like texture, something to rest against. Clara's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. 3 emails. 1 message from a colleague, a calendar reminder for a Monday meeting she had not yet prepared for. She read the first line of the message and felt the familiar internal bracing, the small tightening behind her sternum that had become so ordinary she rarely noticed it anymore. She noticed it now, here, because the rest of her had gone so completely soft. Clara pressed the screen dark and slid the phone back into her pocket. Nora, who had been hanging the dish towel neatly over the oven handle, said nothing, but she may have smiled, briefly, at the middle distance. The guest room was at the end of the upstairs hall, and the quilt on the bed was the one Clara remembered. Wedding ring pattern in faded blues and creams, cool and slightly weighted in the way old quilts are, as though they've absorbed enough time to have substance. Clara stood at the window before turning in. The meadow below was silver under the moon, perfectly still. She stayed there longer than made any practical sense, and she did not mind at all. Clara woke to pale light sliding across the ceiling and the distant, unhurried sound of a crow, announcing something to no one in particular. Her body felt different than it had yesterday, heavier in a good way, the way a stone settles into riverbed. She lay still for a moment and let herself be surprised by how little urgency she felt. Downstairs, the smell of coffee had already done its quiet work. She found Nora on the porch, tucked into the corner of the swing, with a wool shawl the colour of dead leaves draped across her shoulders, and both hands wrapped around a mug. Biscuit lay at her feet in a state of such profound repose that only the small, bellowing rise and fall of his ribs confirmed he was alive. A second mug waited on the small side table, steam curling up and dissolving into the cool October air. Clara settled into the swing beside Nora without a word. The seat shifted and creaked its greeting, and the meadow spread out below them, silver grey with morning frost still, leaves releasing from the maples in slow, unhurried pairs. They sat like that for a while. Clara's mind made one small attempt at the week ahead. A Tuesday presentation, the invoice she hadn't sent, the inbox she'd deliberately refused to look at since last night. She opened her mouth, and what came out was, "I should probably check whether anything came in overnight." "Has anything ever improved?" Nora asked pleasantly, still watching the meadow, because someone answered it before breakfast. Clara considered this with genuine honesty. "No," she admitted, "not once." Nora nodded, as if this confirmed a long-held theory, and took a sip of her coffee. After a comfortable silence, Nora began to speak in the particular sideways way she had, not announcing a story, just allowing one to surface. She said that Clara's grandfather, 50 years ago, almost to the season, had spent an entire Saturday afternoon repairing this very swing. A chain had rusted, a board had warped. A reasonable person might have finished the job in an hour. Walter Whitmore had taken 4. Clara glanced at the swing's painted wood, the chains worn smooth at the grip, and said nothing. "He wasn't slow," Nora said. "He was deliberate. He told me afterward that anything built for the purpose of resting deserved to be made without hurrying." She paused, watching a leaf spiral down through still air. "He thought rest was a kind of listening, not laziness, not reward you had to earn, just listening, to to whatever you'd been too busy to hear. The swing creaked gently. Biscuit issued a long, shuddering sigh from somewhere deep in a dream. Clara reached over to the side table, picked up her phone, looked at the dark screen for one quiet moment, and placed it face down. She didn't put it in her pocket. She left it there, on the table, face down, in the open air, where it could be seen to not be attended to. It felt, surprisingly, like putting down something heavy she hadn't known she was carrying. Nora said nothing about it. Of course she didn't. They stayed on the swing for a long time after that. Longer than Clara could have tracked, even if she'd wanted to. They talked about clouds and whether one resembled a boot or a badger. They observed that a crow had returned and appeared to be holding a grudge against a particular fence post. Biscuit snored with the theatrical commitment of an elderly dog who had mastered comfort as an art form. At some point Clara laughed, a real one, loose and unguarded, and said she had forgotten that a day could feel this long when nobody was chasing it. Nora smiled into her mug and did not disagree. The morning had loosened something in Clara, and by afternoon it had let go entirely. Nora handed her a wicker basket and a pair of garden shears without much explanation, and Clara accepted them, as though this had always been the natural order of her Saturdays. They moved slowly along the far edge of the property, where the herb beds grew in cheerful defiance of any formal arrangement. Rosemary sprawling into thyme, a forgotten clump of sage gone wonderfully woody and wild. Biscuit accompanied them at his preferred pace, which was to say he moved approximately 4 feet, investigated something invisible in the grass with great seriousness, and then stopped to reconsider his entire trajectory. Clara clipped stems and held them to her nose without being asked. The rosemary smelled like something she wanted to remember. Nora pointed out where a fence post had gone soft at the base and mentioned it with the same measured calm one might use to describe clouds rolling in. Not a problem, merely a fact the world had offered up, and she intended to address in her own time. Clara found herself nodding, filing it away as wisdom rather than procrastination. There was a difference, she was beginning to think. Back inside, Nora set Clara to work, slicing apples while she built up the wood stove, with the efficient economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times. The slices fanned out across the cutting board, pale and neat, and Clara arranged them on a plate beside a wedge of sharp cheddar and some crackers from a tin that had been in Nora's pantry long enough to feel like a permanent resident. The afternoon light fell across the kitchen table in long amber planks, warm and specific and unhurried. They talked about nothing consequential. Nora mentioned that pumpkin soup froze beautifully if you left out the cream, and added it fresh when reheating. Practical, useful, the kind of information Clara actually wanted to carry back to the city. They discussed the porch boards that had been threatening to need attention since approximately the previous administration. Nora observed that tomatoes ripened on their own schedule, regardless of anyone's feelings about it. And Clara laughed and said she knew several colleagues who operated the same way. At some point, Clara reached for her phone, purely out of reflex, the way one checks a pocket for keys that are already in hand. and then let her hand drop without following through. She noticed she hadn't checked the time in hours and was surprised to find that this felt like an accomplishment rather than a lapse. The decision came quietly, the way the good ones sometimes do. She was not leaving early on Sunday. She would stay through the afternoon. She had nowhere to be that mattered more than this. By the time evening drew the colour from the meadow and left everything soft and grey-blue, Clara and Nora were back on the porch swing, with the good wool blanket pulled across both their laps and mugs of something hot between their palms. Biscuit had arranged himself across their feet with practiced accuracy. Clara said, entirely seriously and only mostly joking, that Nora ought to consider applying for some sort of licensure, that she appeared to be running an unauthorized convalescent home for exhausted women, and was frankly very good at it. Nora pulled the blanket an inch higher and said she preferred to think of it as a porch. Clara came downstairs to find Nora already at the stove, the kitchen dense with steam and the bright mineral smell of hot tomatoes. A row of glass jars stood along the counter like small sentinels. Nora had her back turned and her apron strings tied in a lopsided bow, and she was humming something without apparent concern for what song it was. Clara did not ask if she needed help. She simply found the second apron on its hook by the door, tied it on, and crossed to the sink to start washing jars. Nora glanced over, noted this with quiet satisfaction, and handed her the jar lifter without a word. Biscuit stationed himself in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, which was close enough to supervise and far enough to be blameless if anything dropped. He watched the proceedings with the grave attention of a retired official observing a process he had once been responsible for. The work settled into its own rhythm, blanching, peeling, packing, and the windows fogged at the edges until the meadow beyond them disappeared entirely and the kitchen became its own small world. Clara found she did not mind the occasional burn of steam on her wrist, the slipperiness of a peeled tomato, the sticky sweetness that got under her fingernails. These were real inconveniences, and they felt, strangely, like a relief, something you could not schedule or defer. Nora ladled leftover pumpkin soup into 2 bowls for breakfast and set them on the table, between the jar lids and the dish towel, as though this were perfectly conventional, which, Clara had quietly decided, it was. They ate standing at first, then sitting, the soup warm and familiar now, like something that had always been part of Sunday mornings and simply taken until now to arrive. Before Clara could begin to gather herself toward leaving, Nora had already filled a wide-mouthed jar with the remaining soup, sealed it, and wrapped a thick heel of bread in a cloth napkin. She set both beside Clara's bag near the door with the efficient tenderness of someone who has been sending people off well-fed for decades and intends to continue. Clara packed slowly. She folded her sweater twice. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table, the stove, the row of finished tomato jars gleaming faintly in the grey Sunday light. She walked out to the porch once more and stood without sitting, just looking at the meadow, which had lost none of its stillness overnight. At the car, Nora hugged her, properly, both arms, the kind of hug that accounts for the full weight of a person. Then she held Clara at arm's length and said, with complete seriousness, to rest, before she thought she'd earned it, because that was precisely the point. Clara said she would try. Nora said trying was sufficient. Then she called Biscuit, who shuffled forward, pressed his broad butterscotch head against Clara's knee, and exhaled with the deep sincerity that only an old dog can produce. Clara kept her hand on him, for a moment longer than necessary. Then she got in the car. The jar of soup rode in the passenger seat, wrapped in the cloth napkin, faintly warm. Clara's phone stayed in her bag. She drove down the hill and out, between the blazing maples, and onto the quiet road, and for the first long stretch, she did not reach for anything. She thought about small things. Soup for breakfast, the weight of a good hug, the way a porch could hold you. She thought that a life could be built from exactly this, not grand and sudden, but warm and chosen, moment by gathered moment. She thought she might begin.